Hello, thank you for joining me. I'm Dan Abella, and I'm the organizer of the Philip K. Dick Film Festival. I'm also the organizer of the Psychedelic Film and Music Festival. Every year, I put together these festivals with the goal of increasing awareness about uh, either Philip K. Dick, the themes that ran through his work, and the psychedelic dimension, whether it be plant medicine, meditation, other forms of altering consciousness. And I think at the end, the two are very much connected as a result. However, I don't want to talk about psychedelics today or want to talk about Philip K. Dick. What I do want to talk about is a concept that has been circulating in the media for a long that is called mass formation psychosis. Now, for those who are not familiar with this concept, it first hit the airwaves big time a couple weeks back during the Joe Rogan interview with the Dr. Robert Malone. Dr. Robert Malone is credited with having advanced some of the technology that's used in the mRNA vaccine, which is a vaccine, as you all know, is the one that delivers the information, the mRNA to inside the cell so that the spike proteins can be produced. Dr. Malone, however, has made some rather controversial comments about the vaccine itself and some long-term impact on our body. And although that's not really the theme or the platform of this subject matter, because I'm going to take a very nonpartisan approach to what's happening. I think there's plenty of people on both sides of the aisle that will argue for one way or the other. But my position is going to be more like the referee here, who's really looking at both sides and seeing who's making the mistake and who isn't, and where are they going a little bit overboard. And more specifically, I want to bring up this concept of mass formation psychosis, which actually it was coined by a professor of Tobias Desmet at the University of Ghent. He's a professor of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and he has over 1,500 citations to his name, and he's written several articles on mass formation psychosis. Now, Robert Malone read that article, the various of his articles, and decided to talk about it during his interview with Joe Rogan. And the thing absolutely blew off. I mean, we have over 60 million people right now that have seen that interview. So for those who are interested in catching it, I don't think you can catch it anymore on YouTube or Facebook or any of that. You actually have to go to Spotify and watch it for yourself. I have my own opinion about the veracity of what Malone is talking about. However, I'm only asking you to go there and judge for yourself and really think for yourself, which is really the most important thing that I think we can take away when we are considering the where we are. We are in the midst of this whirlpool of data, information, and opinions, and so on. Critical thinking is the key thing I want to really promote here. Philip K. Dick talked about it, and psychedelic practices also enhance critical thinking, whether it be meditation or chanting or drumming. It's a kind of an integration. So going back to mass formation psychosis, well, that was originally coined by Tobias Desmet. I think maybe even like 6 months ago, 6 or 8 months ago. And what it refers to is the equivalent is, I would say, of mass hysteria or mass hypnosis. Is a kind of condition that we've seen throughout history. It's sort of like a psychic seizure that takes over groups and it holds them for a specific period of time. Now, you look back at the ancient history, we can look back to Rome, for instance, ancient Rome, and the advent of leprosy. And at that time, leprosy was regarded, lepers were scapegoated and as essentially cursed by the gods. And there was an attempt to segregate them from the rest of the society because they inherently brought evil and negativity to the world. As we move a little bit forward through the Middle Ages, we come to the Black Plague. Same thing. Then we go to the Salem witch trials. More recently, we've seen the Dreyfus Affair, which took place in 19th century France, where and it was a case of anti-Semitism, which and then after that, the Russian Revolution the Nazi Revolution, the Red Scare, and the list goes on. So there are always these moments where the culture seems to be hijacked by a thought form, a global thought form, which I will refer to it here as a vast active living system, very similar to Philip K. Dick's version, except it's not coming from Sirius, but it's coming from our communication systems. And I'm going to go into details later on how that accelerates the process. So mass formation psychosis, according to Dr. Desmet, is the equivalent of mass hysteria or mass madness. Now, from the beginning, when I heard mass psychosis, I had some my reservations because, from a purely clinical standpoint, psychosis is someone who is psychotic has a complete breakdown from reality. He starts reaching conclusions that cannot be verified and that often are at odds with what's happening in front of him. And I've had a good number of patients that are psychotic and think is very radical than just mass delusion. And mass delusion, for instance, the tulip mania, that was as another example of mass delusion. That for a moment there is this craze and it's a mass contagion. Everybody's picking up on each other's thoughts and there's a circulation. It's sort of a self-aggregating kind of current that emerges from that. So mass formation psychosis is a condition that's mass hysteria that is basically created, according to Dr. Desmet, by four components. And let me see if I can read them up here to you for you. The first component is alienation. Alienation is a concept that we are disconnected from our work, we're disconnected from our society, we're disconnected from others. Alienation is the first component. The second component in mass formation psychosis is a lack of sense making, that things don't make sense, that there's an eeriness, there's a strangeness to reality. And that is part of mass formation psychosis. The third is the sense of a free-floating anxiety. It's a sense of there's something about the world that we're not really familiar with, and just get my we're not really sorry we're not. It's a sense of the world that we are that there is something wrong with oneself, with the world. It's free floating anxiety. That was a term that's actually a classic term used in psychoanalysis. It's not so much used in behavioral therapy such as NLP or CBT or EMDR and so on, but it's used in free floating anxiety. A sense that something is not right with either the person or with the world. And the fourth is a general discontent with oneself and one's position. So all these factors coupled together create a tremendous inner stress. And according to Dr. Desmet, they're just waiting for the right narrative to come along, the right moment that will sort of cathect or constellate all these forces into one specific narrative. Now, for those who were all of us, right after the beginning of the pandemic, were very concerned. Some more than others. We weren't sure what kind of impact this was going to have across the whole population. So it certainly leads to one to believe that there may be a good basis to Dr. Desmet's belief that this created a kind of a point of focus through which everything else is excluded. But before we go with Dr. Desmet's theory, I want to roll back a little bit to some moments that existed before the pandemic. And he's kind of skims over during his talks about it, but I do believe for our purposes, it's a really good idea. It all starts, as you all know, with the 2016 presidential election, which caught a lot of people by surprise. A lot of people were shocked that Trump had been elected, and they felt from the beginning there was talk about Russian collusion, Chinese collusion. There was I remember reading about Cambridge Analytics, which was seemed to aggregate a huge number of voters that helped Trump, and Steve Bannon was behind that. So there was this talk that perhaps this was an illegitimate election, that in fact someone else had helped Trump along the way. And almost from the beginning of his presidency, where there's talk about, well, let's create this group or this committee to explore how much Russian collusion Mueller was involved, and at the end it was inconclusive. However, there was this sense that there's something wrong with Trump, that he was up to no good, that he's trying to change society, and certainly the way he behaves, it wouldn't would might show somebody that is this guy is absolutely out of his mind. So there was some behavioral signals that he was giving that suggested more. But the fact is that 4 years, and there wasn't conclusive enough evidence to prove him otherwise. However, there was the impeachment, and he was kind of reined in, especially for the last year during his tenure. So there was this anxiety. There's something is wrong. There's something wrong with the country. Just keep in mind that in 2016, around that time, the New York Times had received a huge capital infusion. It was losing money because everything was going to digital, and so the presses were looking for an angle through which they could sell more papers. Now, when Trump was elected, it fell right in their laps. So as Trump once said, the New York Times and myself kind of help each other out. And there's a little bit of truth in that. In fact, if it had been a very boring presidency, New York Times would probably have lost a lot of money. But that really it's a little astray from what I'm talking about. In addition to the Trump presidency, we also had these various attacks and various incidents throughout that program that led to a kind of an awakening of sorts, of people questioning the media. Now, this is the problem, though. The mainstream media decides around 2019 through the Trusted News Initiative to essentially start focusing on misinformation, because Facebook and Twitter and other channels started getting a lot of heat because essentially they were creating these echo chambers, as referred by the media, and silos of fanatics, essentially people that just believe one way and that's it. So essentially, the Trusted News Initiative was developed. It came around 2019 to try to challenge that, to look at news and really start filtering information so that it wouldn't go off the track. So here we are, various components that are being assembled during from 2016 to 2020 that suggested something else was happening. Now, in addition to that, there have been various books that have been written. Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dime is a classic book. How a lot of Americans really felt cheated by the system. A lot of the Americans felt that they were not being represented. And most of them came from quote unquote Trump country. They didn't come from the East Coast or the West Coast. They came from the heartland. And there was a sense that the New York Times bureaus didn't spend too much time in Missouri or Alabama or Mississippi or so on. That was focusing on the left and the West, and it's still, unfortunately, still happening today. There's a lot of that truth. So from the beginning, there was also this sense the rise of the elitists, which is groups of self-appointed groups, both on the East Coast and the West Coast, that essentially talk down to people because they're not smart enough, they don't know better. Just remember that old statement by Obama about, well, they just love their guns and religion. Regardless how truth is that's just something you just don't say. Already there was this kind of confrontational attitude. But it certainly is exacerbated during the Trump years. So already there is some degree of polarization. While the alt media, or even basically the internet media, was focusing primarily on presenting alternative models to what was happening, whereas the mainstream media seemed to support democratic-based agendas. So here we are, already there is this kind of dialectic that's being created between one media group and another. So come to 2019, you got the Trusted News Initiative, and then 2020, around that time is when you start having this discussion about these various these various developments during the COVID pandemic. Now, I remember when I was here and I was here at my office, I had a couple of patients that acted in a very, very strange way. For instance, one of them had, I couldn't reach her for weeks at a time. and I had been dealing. I've been working with her son because he was suffering from intense anxiety attacks. And I tried reaching her and contacting her, and she said, "No, no, I cannot talk to anybody. I'm keeping my son safe." And this kept on, and other patients of mine reported the same kind of attitude. So I started wondering whether there's something else that's being created. Now, in my book, The Theater of the Mind, which I wrote and publishing back in 2021, I talk about the convergence of communication systems to create what I refer to as a visionary, parapsychological consciousness. Essentially, it's almost like these systems are communicating with each other, regardless of the source of the communication. For instance, today an example that would be algorithms, right? How many times you say you're applying for a loan, and it's no longer the bank agent, but an algorithm. Or let's say you want to get your credit score, it's an algorithm. So algorithms essentially are communicating with each other. So in my model, which I talk about in the theater of the mind, this has come as a third consciousness begins to emerge. A kind of a consciousness that is essentially developed through multiple communication systems. And this is I noticed that really amped up in the early in the pandemic. For instance, one thing and I have an actual YouTube clip from back in early 2020. One of the things I noticed about it is that from the minute they announced the lockdown, there was very little talk about immunity. I would say, well, what we got to take D3, vitamin zinc, vitamin C, vitamin E. There was no talk about that, none at all. I mean, and I was saying, well, this is something that everybody should talk about. I mean, because although it's true that this virus seemed to be a different kind of virus, it's always good to strengthen our immune system. And almost every doctor you talk with will say, yes, you got to take vitamin C, vitamin D, especially D. During the winter months, we tend to be deficient in vitamin D, D3. However, there was very little talk about that. And I'm asking myself, how come they're not really mentioning this in the paper or in the talk? 3 or 4 months later, they started talking a little bit about it, but not in the beginning. So I said, well, there's something going on here. They're not really addressing the collateral damage of people being anxious in a lockdown state. Instead, they're just focusing to repeat the mantra after me, which is 15 days to flatten the curve, build back better, safe distance, 6 feet away. So it was very stressful for everybody. In fact, Mark McDonald, who is another writer that I mentioned here in this in the blurb, uh, regards this is a kind of cult type environment. We are asked to be shut down, stay at home, don't talk to your neighbor, wear your mask, fear coming through the phone, through television, through the computer. I recall that was virtually 24/7 nonstop fear mongering. Now, for those who are familiar with my work, I point to some developments back in 9/11. And right after 9/11, a lot of people developed PTSD as a result of being glued to the television or watching those towers fall one after another. These included people that were thousands of miles away. They were not in New York City. I was in New York. I was in the Upper West Side. These people were thousands, yet developed PTSD. And there is a report that concludes that there is a correlation between the number of hours that someone watches and the prevalence of PTSD. More recently, there's been also a new report that came out that it correlates. And now all these reports, by the way, I will put them on the links below at the end of this podcast, that correlates the incidence of mental illness with the amount of hours you actually watch. So here I'm very aware of what's happening, having beginning to write this book. Yet there is very little awareness in the media. Is there clearly there is something that's going on and people are dying. But then what leads to this disinformation complex? Well, there are a lot of things that we can begin to discuss. The first thing is a few weeks or a few months into it, you start watching these videos these nurses dancing. And someone who was more said, "Well, how is it they're dancing?" So there was this talk. One part of the narrative is, "Oh yes, they're really they're this whole COVID is a hoax that doesn't exist. The virus has never been isolated. Um, these nurses are dancing because no one is dying." And then you heard that thousands were dying every day, and the numbers kept going up. And then you heard, well, it's 35,000. If you actually assign 35, if someone is checked in, they have COVID, you put them on a ventilator, you get an extra $35,000. At the beginning, I couldn't believe that. And I said, why is that happening? Then you read another account, which is, well, if someone dies, he could be in a motorcycle accident. But if he dies, he has COVID, well, you tell him he's died of COVID. More recently, we have Colin Powell, sorry, who had cancer, and when he died, his death was from COVID. So you start asking, wait a minute, COVID is what? So when do you actually die from COVID versus a comorbidity? And that was really not discussed very clearly. So I remember going on the computer and checking, and everybody had an opinion. You had one guy who says, no, there's no virus. It has never been isolated. And then another person says it has been isolated, but we really don't know what it does. And the list went on. But in the meantime, things that would empower us were omitted. For instance, it's well known, I talk about it in the book, that 60 to 70% of Americans are overweight. And so a true leader would have said, okay, guys, it's time to get in shape. Now you need to lose weight. You need to take vitamin C. You need to take vitamin D. You need to take at least, number one, that does two things. Number one, it actually boosts your immune system. Number two, it gives people a sense of control over their own lives. As you know, my part of philosophy is about empowerment and truly self-reliance, and not relying on other systems to tell me how to think and what to think. But in fact, that narrative was omitted from the beginning. And I spoke to a lot of my patients, and they all said the same thing. I would always tell them, well, it's very important until we find out, either develop a vaccine or develop some kind of prophylactic treatment. In the meantime, you gotta boost up your immune system. And I would let them know, okay, you gotta take your vitamin C, you gotta take your vitamin D, you gotta take your vitamin E, you gotta take selenium, you gotta take zinc, you gotta take other herbal treatments. And the ones who did follow my suggestion, a lot of them were much better off than the ones who just got pumped their body with junk food. And the thing with junk food is, I've had junk food, I've eaten it, and I love it. The problem is, it spikes your insulin level, and when your insulin level is spiked, it drops your immune system. Also, lack of sleep. It's no good for your immune system. So there are a lot of little things that were omitted. Eventually, once the damage had been done, 6 months into the pandemic, yes, you had a lot of doctors coming out saying you can do this, you should do that. But from the mainstream media, there was very little talk about that. So you can see already through this kind of the way the information is being presented, people start wondering who's really in charge here. And critical thinkers will say, who's really running the show? Hundreds of thousands of small businesses were wiped out. So here we are with hundreds of thousands of businesses wiped out. We also seen someone like Bezos and Elon Musk and others become uber billionaires. I mean, these guys reach 200 or 300 billion. So there's a sense of unfairness that starts creeping in. It's like these guys are doing well. The middle class is being wiped out. And here we are, we've been told to go into lockdown. So what's in it for me? One thing I said in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 is I say it's very important for you guys to think at some point that this pandemic will end. What are you going to be doing afterwards? Because this idea of going back to normal will not happen anymore. We'll have post-COVID, but as post 9/11, now it'll be post-Corona society. And unfortunately, that's what's going on right now. So I've been always trying to look at impartial approaches to dealing with this current situation. And one of the things I absolutely emphasize that we look at all the information. Now I started reading Robert Kennedy. I've always been a big fan of his. And I noticed he's been taking on some very controversial positions. I said, well, that's really unusual. I would expect him to be more what the other side is doing. So I'm reading both what each side is saying. and I'm coming to my own conclusion. So back to what's to the mass formation psychosis is essentially we have an aggregation of communication systems that are essentially vying for each other for control. So you had the mainstream media, which seems to be delivering almost the same identical message, partially as a result of the trusted news initiative, but also a sense that they're almost repeating exactly the same words. So that begs the question: who is the handler here? Who's telling them the truth? Who's giving the information? I would say it doesn't have to be a covert group. Some people have pointed out to Davos and the Great Reset program, which, by the way, it's really funny because in the middle of the pandemic, what did they do? They actually show this guy with smiling to the camera and saying, "In 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy." This is like the worst marketing campaign ever, because someone who the last thing you want to people who as Americans we value ownership, whether ownership of a home, ownership of a car, ownership of something, and to be told you'll be happy suggests a different agenda. Now, it's very well be this could be a marketing ploy, but it was terrible. It's a kind of technocracy which is disconnected from the needs of the average people. And I think that's always been the problem with a lot of the elites. They spend too much time in their ivory towers, and they don't really come down to earth and work with the people. I mean, when I work with some of my techniques in NLP and EMDR, I often come across a lot of resistance, and they tell me, "Oh, this is not there's not enough evidence-based protocol to advance this particular technique, or there haven't been enough double-blind studies to do this." And I would say, "Look, I work with these people, I use this technique, and 9 out of 10 times it works." And it will take maybe years before we have enough double blind experiments to do it correctly. For instance, a good friend of mine who is a pediatrician will say, yes, it takes sometimes up to 20 years. So are you saying, are you willing to sacrifice a whole generation to wait for the evidence-based protocol? You got to help people now. For instance, people are suffering from PTSD. Before the pandemic, it was out of control. Maybe I would say about 1 out of every 11 Americans will come down with PTSD sometime in their life. Now, I believe the percentage is much higher. In fact, I believe that most of the population has some sort of trauma. That's why I call this national trauma and mass formation psychosis. Trauma have exhibit all kinds of symptoms, whether it be restlessness, a lack of proper sleep, anxiety. We've been bombarded with so much negativity and so much bad press, so much misinformation that a lot of us are in a weird kind of what's referred to as a fugue state. So, and that explains this kind of a knee-jerk reaction that a lot of people will have when you say take one position, and then the other side will say no, and then take very violent, because essentially they're acting out of their emotional self, no longer their cognitive self. The emotional self, which is essentially being hijacked by this narrative and also by the trauma itself. It's what's leading to the ideological differences. For instance, even at this stage in the game, recently there's been an idea of calling one group of people ideological, and that's why they don't support this particular treatment. Now, I tend to believe the reason they're not supporting it has to do with trauma, not and fear and anxiety, and it has little to do with ideological positions. An ideological position can be argued, but when it's rooted in trauma and pain and anxiety, there's nothing you can say to these people that will change their mind. And you can see it on both sides of the aisle. So if I talk to an anti-vaxxer or a vax choice person, he has a particular position, and that's that. There's no way he's going to change. And then you talk to the other side, the ones who've taken the vaccine and nothing has happened. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, I recently spoke to two women whose both sons have myocarditis. They developed shortly after getting the injection. Now, we've been told that myocarditis is very rare, very rare. Well, I mean, I'm no statistician, but I do find that it's very unusual that I have to have a certain number of patients, and out of those, a few of them have children, and out of those, two develop myocarditis. Well, maybe something else is going on that needs to be explored. So this idea is very rare. If it's so rare, how come I happen to see such a large sample within a short period of time? But this is anecdotal. The point is that in order for us to move forward as a group, as a nation, we've got to heal the wounds. And right now, there's very little talk about healing the wounds caused by the pandemic, by the pain. Hundreds of thousands of people saw their loved ones die in front of them. They couldn't say hello because they were either in nursing homes or they were wrapped up in some kind of plastic. And this we talk about unresolved grief, unresolved trauma. A lot of people are still wondering what's going to happen in 2022 for them or 2021 after the pandemic is over. Have you ever asked yourself what happened to all those hundreds of thousands of middle class jobs that were wiped out? And no one is talking about it. It's not the New York Post, the New York Times. Nobody's talking about it. So maybe there is good reason, but you can see why there is this. There are some groups that might opt for a more alternative version of reality, such as this idea that we are essentially the middle class is being wiped out intentionally, so that you can buy, so that the big boys can buy these properties pennies on the dollar. And when you look at the facts, I'm seeing here in New York City, there's a lot of truth to that kind of logic. Catherine Austin Fitts, who was a secretary to the housing, assistant secretary to housing and urban development, spoke about trillions of dollars of unaccounted that have been essentially siphoned off pension funds for the last 30 years. She's no conspiracy tinfoil hat. You can read her. She can go to Solari Report and read about her. In fact, in the book, the Theater of the Mind, at the very end, I have a play where I interacting with a veteran, and he cites her. So there's a lot of information that's really that doesn't add up, and that's the I don't want to reach any conclusions here, but it just doesn't add up, and you have to ask yourself, well, how will it add up? Can it add up? Perhaps we just run by a bunch of incompetent people. Perhaps the CDC, the FDA, Fauci, they all just don't know what they're talking about. I mean, clearly they seem to be changing their minds. So many times people have lost track. For instance, the beginning, you couldn't even touch anyone. You couldn't touch a subject. That might be contagious. And then later they said, no, it doesn't stay on the surface of anything. Then, you got to keep 6 feet away. But they said, no, 6 feet is too short. You got to be 12 feet away. Somebody said, no, you got to be 18 feet away. They kept changing their mind. But this is the problem. When the information, the quote unquote truth, gets changed, that creates a hypnotic effect. When day is night and night is day, and that keeps recycling every time, that creates a hypnotic effect. In fact, one characteristic of psychotic patients is what's referred to as double bind structures. So yes is no, no is yes, and they're in a state of paralysis. So we've been fed information. Perhaps information was just evolving over time, but at least they could have said that. But instead, they just gave it with the certainty of fact, when in fact even today the information keeps changing. So we need to understand that what we're seeing through the media is filtered through the lenses of the special interest groups that are promoting that. It's well known that Pfizer supports Anderson Cooper, and a big percentage of the revenue that a lot of companies receive, especially mainstream, they come from big pharma. In fact, the U.S. and Australia are the only two countries where pharmaceutical companies can advertise. So, this creates a sense of an opportunity. So let's understand very clearly that there are money interests here and keeping the narrative going. You have the New York Times losing money in 2016, so they were ramping up this idea that the election was stolen, that Trump was essentially a Russian mole, and so on. And now you have big pharma pushing money interests. Now maybe that's the way it always worked. Now it's much worse, or maybe now our eyes are being opened to that. But I want all of you to really think very critically about the information that is being given to you, because it clearly it varies from source to source, and there's a reason why it does. There's often conflict of interest. For instance, when after Robert Malone has his interview with Joe Rogan, there was a fact check from Reuters that said that it suggested that Malone really didn't have authority to speak of that. But it turns out that Reuters is is actually sponsored by Pfizer. I'm not saying that Pfizer is good or bad. That's up to you to decide. That's not really my position. My position is you got to look at the numbers, look at the facts. People have died, but also we also consider from COVID. There's no doubt about that, and many have died. But we also got to look at the collateral damage that's often ignored: the beatings, the child abuse, the opium, the drug abuse, the drug deaths, heart attacks, unemployment. That's collateral, huge collateral damage that is very rarely discussed. But why? I mean, if we look at that death is a death. It's always a tragic event, whether it happens from a disease or from a car accident. So how come we just focusing on only one aspect? But collectively, that creates a kind of trance. When you just focus on one specific subject, day in, day out, never ends, it narrows your field of vision until it's a tunnel. In fact, Robert Anton Wilson, who was a good friend of our Philip K. Dick, talked about tunnel vision, or beliefs are tunnel visions. Because, for instance, right now, you let's pick up any paper. It doesn't matter what paper it is, right? The, the current pandemic, that's all they talk about. So, economy, very little. Unemployment, very little. In fact, we have a booming economy. I hope you know that. Everybody has jobs, right? But that's a subject for another discussion. But the point is that there is a kind of a narrowing of field of consciousness, and that's classic hypnosis. That's done through the media by focusing on one theme. Essentially, I would call this a COVID-centric 2 years. Everything revolves around COVID. This is essentially around everything revolves around the leader. It's a kind of a big brother approach, whether intentional or not, really secondary, because the kind of emergent phenomenon that's being created through these various systems of communication, which is the subject of this book which I'm writing, it kind of mutes that point. It doesn't matter whether it was Davos supporting Trudeau and Macron and coaching them, and which is actually true. It doesn't matter, or it's a communication system. It's a kind of a third consciousness. By third is I have my consciousness, your consciousness, and there's this third consciousness, which is precise. That is essentially a kind of pseudo AI. It's not quite Valis for those who are familiar with PKD, but we're getting there, because essentially this is run through systems. It's beyond our control. So there is this third consciousness which is essentially shaping the kind of narrative that we are being fed. And unfortunately, for those who want to challenge that, they're being banned, they're being deplatformed, they're taken out. And sometimes they're not really saying much. But right now, there is this idea that anything, even using the word pandemic, might get you deplatformed, which is insane. It's like, why do that? Why are you afraid of the truth? In the Testaments, the truth shall set you free, but they seem to have forgotten that. You want to have more discourse, more dialogue. I would love a dialogue between, say, Robert Kennedy and Walensky, for instance, Rochelle Walensky, CDC. I would love that, because if you listen to him, he's got some really good points, but she's got some interesting points to say too. So it's not like, okay, one is, no, all between Walensky, all between Fauci and Kennedy, but you're never going to see that. In fact, recently when Fauci, Robert Kennedy has written a book. It's called The Real Anthony Fauci. I haven't read it, but I understand it's very, very powerful, and it really incriminates Fauci in certain wrongdoings. I cannot take an opinion on that, but it's interesting that Fauci never really criticized Kennedy for the book. He just said, oh, he's a disturbed individual. So what we're seeing is the rise of ad hominem attacks. Why is that? Why can't you just challenge them on the science itself? If I'm saying this is true, I can disprove you on that, and not necessarily attack the character of the individual. So you just look at that. So the ad hominem versus critical thinking, scientific thinking. Now, no one has a monopoly. I want to emphasize, none of these people have a monopoly on the truth. It doesn't matter how compelling one group tells it. They don't. They all have a vested interest. Remember, follow the money. Who benefits? And almost everybody's gotta survive. So sometimes they will be pushing a particular narrative because they're gonna get more eyeballs, they're gonna get more views, they may even get a sponsor. Who knows? That's part of it. In fact, there's very little real science going on today. It's mostly corporate science, and unfortunately. And that's something that Tobias talks about in his in Mass Formation Psychosis. So basically, let's go back to the 1920s, right? You had the rise of Hitler, mid 20s to late 20s, early 30s. But one thing that he used very effectively was the communication systems of the time, essentially radio and television. In fact, he introduced television way before we got it here in the States. And through these powerful communication systems, he was able to essentially magnify his message to the whole German population. And through the rallies, through the various propaganda technology, he was able to concentrate almost in a laser beam approach the message of the National Socialists. And FDR, of course, had his fireside chats, which were not as intense, but they also provided a sense of soothing during the Great Depression. So communication really is powerful, except no one runs that today. No one runs the communication system. It's all almost self-run. So you have all these different personalities saying some of them are agreeing with others. So I would tend to believe that a lot of people in the alt media tend to be aside with one particular narrative, and the ones in the mainstream with the other. And there are some people who are on both sides of the aisle, but that's very rare. So the idea is that no one has a real monopoly, but essentially the mass formation psychosis is created through the aggregation of multiple communication systems, whether it be the television, whether it be the radio, whether it be the phones we use, and so forth. And there are definitely ways we can fight it. And one way is not just critical thinking. One way is to really take time every night to really connect with ourselves. Now, some people do so through meditation. Others do so through prayer. Others do so through chanting. If you have someone, a significant other, that helps. You want to create a space of where you can really be yourself, and you can. If there's any anxiety or any stress or any anger, let that come to surface and create that. Be with the anger without identifying with it. That's the key thing. That's one of the main principles of mindfulness meditation. Be with it without identifying. Allow the anger to be, and you can still step back and be with that anger, as you're being with, let's say, a little boy or a little girl, growing up. And mindfulness is good. Um, Zen meditation, mindfulness meditation, uh, prayer, they're all good because essentially we need to find a spiritual center that we can project and for even for if it's only for a few minutes, forget about our worries and just be with that center. It's essential. Critical thinking will only take you so far, but before you even go there, you really gotta be connected with who you are and what is your goal and how you working with the the narrative. See, for a lot of people, this gives them a sense of meaning. This is what Tobias talks about, a sense of certainty. Because once you have these four components, discontent, alienation, free-floating anxiety, and lack of sense-making, they're crystallizing through a narrative that gives us a tremendous sense of meaning. Problem is that meaning that meaning will last as long as that narrative exists. But the problem is sooner or later it goes away, something else, and then it collapses. The free floating anxiety emerges. So I would suggest that those who have any sense of anxiety, reach out to your good friends and really don't talk about the pandemic, but talk about who you are, what you want, what you really want. I mean, for a lot of us, this has been a time of soul searching. And in fact, it's no accident that 4.5 million Americans will not be returning to their jobs. Because you see, that reflects what Tobias was saying earlier, which is Many were not happy with their jobs. It gave them no sense of meaning, no sense of connection. They feel like machines. So they'd rather take a chance, maybe of starting a small business or learning another profession. And that's one thing that the pandemic has taught us, an opportunity to look at the world in a different way, not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of possibility. And maybe kind of a wake up call to something better that's waiting for us on the other side. And that's really a critical way, one way of looking, of reframing what's happening to us. At the end of the day, Viktor Frankl talks about during Man's Search of Meaning, talks about what was the difference between those who survived, were able to manage during the concentration camp, and those who didn't. And he came up with the idea was that we have to search for meaning, and the idea sense of meaning in difficult times, rather than saying this is horrible, this is I cannot wait for it to change, to drop, to move away, get away. Just find meaning. And meaning is done generally through work, some kind of activity that gives you a sense of who you are, that replenishes your soul, that nurtures, that nourishes your soul. It's no accident that a lot of us were not allowed to go to church or a synagogue or a temple or religion because as a result of the lockdown. And attendance has gone downhill. We also social creatures. And it's important that we really reconnect with others. And unfortunately, I think one side of the impact, the after impact of the pandemic will be for many of us will still be wearing masks even after the pandemic is over. I've seen people that are running in the middle of nowhere and with their mask on, or people are driving inside a car, windows are have been closed, they're wearing a mask. That is a kind of strange behavior that's being elicited when massive pressure is being born. Um, Another writer who talks about the state of fear, she mentions that talks about the pandemic and the lockdown. It was very reminiscent of cult-like conditions. You're being shut down. You cannot step outside. The you cannot talk to your neighbor. You must wear a mask. These are limitations on our character that sooner or later begins to shape not only our behavior but how we organize the world. It essentially is a closing in of reality, and by closing it in, we are able to relate to others in a different way. So again, it creates a kind of a tunnel effect, which is similar to the tunnel effect of the media, when the media just focuses on one thing and at the expense of everything else. It's been 2 years, and essentially, if you pick up the news today versus a year or two ago, it's the same thing. COVID is always like the main page, and on and on and on about all the people who are hospitalized. Take, for instance, the most recent, the Omicron variant. Now, the media should be very happy and should be saying this is a good thing because essentially it's going to give people herd immunity. It's a highly transmissible virus, but it's for most people, it's very mild. So the reframe would be this is a great thing. We should all be happy because after it basically washes through the whole world, we'll have immunity against other variants of COVID. But instead, the media is not really, it's kind of downplaying that. And they say, well, maybe there is, they don't want to do that because there is as money interest. They want to keep the vaccine going and they want to make money off the vaccine. Remember that vaccine guys are not the good guys. And it doesn't matter whether this vaccine is effective. They've never been the good guys. People like Pfizer and Moderna, Merck, they have a history of having paid billions of dollars in reparations. And also the other thing is, what about the liability? How come they need liability protection? And just think about that. I mean, I'm a good friend of the chief scientist of Regeneron, George Yancopoulos, and his company doesn't have liability protection. So if you get sick from Regeneron, you can sue them. But how is that Pfizer? Oh, no, you can't do that. So again, this is the kind of disinformation warfare that we have to be aware of. That's why people are nuts, because we are asked to hold many contradictory positions at the same time. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. That creates another level of separation from reality. So you got three levels going on at the same time. One is yes, the disinformation absorption that's coming from the media. One day, masks are good. One day mass bad. One shot is good. No, now you need another second shot. Oh no, now you need a booster. Now you need two boosters. Now you need five boosters. So people say, when does it end? That this is disinformation. It's not disinformation. It's just the science is very bad. They really don't know, and they're not willing to admit it because the government always wants to pretend that it's in control. And so that's the first level. The second is the behavioral encroachment. Don't go outside. Wear masks. Stay at home. Don't talk to your friends. Uh, Make sure everybody's vaccinated, and so on. And the third is the more collective kind of encroachment that comes from the focusing only on deaths, COVID casualties, and not all the others, cancer. I had some clients who died because they were they chose not to go and be operated on. They were so concerned about their disease, about catching COVID. Well, they died from something else. And that's what not is very rarely discussed. So this three levels, three layers of hypnosis that is going on. So Tobias has been asked, Dr. Desmond has been asked, well, who's behind this hypnosis? And he doesn't know the answer. And I suspect there's no one person who's behind that. There may be players, and there's some major world actors involved, but I don't think there's any one person who is behind that. I think I think it's more like that third consciousness that's emerging, that is essentially run by algorithms, and we often forget it's the algorithm. So if you put up something on YouTube and it gets taken down, it's not a person who actually looking at it; it's the algorithm. There is this talk about AI, and especially in our festival, the AI is taking over. The AI has taken over already. It's kind of rough AI. It already has. It already is not like, oh well, it has, and so many decisions. It will continue to involve other decisions, and that's something that we need to be aware of. Yeah, it's not a digital device; it's more of an analog, slowly, and we're seeing that. So that's something to. But at the same time, we also still have some personal sovereignty to be aware of and really connect with others, and that's something to really keep in mind. We really are at a juncture. Hopefully, Omicron will be the last of the variants, although I know they'll try to push something else. But I think that one thing that we really need to be aware of is the necessity to create or have always critical thinking, look at all the information, and not just focus on one theme, on one narrative, on one person, because they don't have the answer either. We're grasping at straws. We really try to put together something, and we really don't know. But each one of us can come up with enough data with a narrative that it feels right to us. And that's the key, because when it feels right to us, and it also feels that we're doing the right thing, the anxiety will slowly go away. In addition, of course, to practicing prayer and meditation and other forms of relaxation that will connect to who you are. It's really critical. We really are at a point in history where we really need to step back and look at what's been happening with a more critical eye, and see how this is changing. And really, you gotta walk away. Who benefits from this? Number one, who benefits? Right? Follow the money. Who's sponsoring this? Who's promoting this? These are the kind of questions you want to ask repeatedly as you begin to explore this narrative that exists. Now, in the red states, they're a little bit more laid back about it, and it's no accident that the blue states have more, because that's where the concentration of communication systems exists. You see, if you're a farmer out there, the few that exist, you probably don't watch television too much. You probably don't spend too much on the computer. You're probably not on YouTube or Facebook or Telegram or whatever. You're just not. You just look at the world, and people in cities, whether it be New York, San Francisco, L.A., Chicago, they tend to be much more. Their lives tend to concern much more around technology. And although technology has a lot of things to offer, it also creates this third consciousness. So if you fall behind, if you kind of like distance yourself a little bit from that, perhaps even take a break from technology once a week. And that's hard for a lot of people. In fact, many young people today will cannot even take a break for an hour from technology, let alone a whole day. But that's probably good for our minds. Be a break from it. Reality is out there. Now, it's no accident that Mark Zuckerberg talks about the metaverse. And there's been a lot of talk about it, about monetizing the metaverse. But think about what that means, be greater immersion into technology. The whole world is out there for us to explore. The world inside our minds and the world out there. We really don't need a metaverse except that for a minimum level of activity, if any. But yet it's being promoted because that's what the big money is going to be promoting that. So this struggle, what I refer to fight for the human mind or for the soul, is going to continue. It took initially you had these various players back in the 50s. The MK Ultra project, for instance, which was a major mind control project, was involved. And but I think everything's out in the open. You just got to keep your eyes open, and you'll see what they're doing. In fact, there were some reports that came out that from Sweden that the government was using psyops to stop quote unquote disinformation, but they're still using psyops. So they're admitting they're using psychological operations on the population to stop them from listening to certain recordings or certain podcasts or face and so on. So it's out there in the open. And that's the interesting thing. If you just look at it, you'll find out. But a lot of people don't have the time. But I would say it's more important to consider the implications if you don't do it than if you do it. You just got to do the research, and you'll find that there is you can draw your own conclusions and be able to. And one thing that Mark McDonald, this is another doctor that I've been reading, talks about the United States of Fear. Talks about is if you come across someone who is very narrow-minded on his position, um, whether it be in favor of vaccines or against vaccines, and you feel they're very rigid, instead of trying to argue with them analytically or dialectically, I would say focus more on the fears. As I sense you're feeling a little bit of anxiety right now. You sense a little agitation. I can sense that. I mean, I really want to, connect with that because I do believe there's a reason you have that anxiety. So you want to connect with them at that level, and then they might open up. In fact, they might open up to listen to the other side. Because right now, that anxiety is essentially creating this kind of hardened ideological position, and it's on the left and the right. So it's not just one group that has a monopoly. That both are very at each other's throats. This is why the very troubling news is coming out about a civil war. Or are we in a cold war? And the media keeps blaming on the other political party instead of thinking that perhaps we're just being traumatized and perhaps we need healing. We need to be healed. Unfortunately, I don't think that the media will step anytime soon to heal us. We essentially got to take that job upon ourselves and really work on ourselves so that we're more open to someone who is totally against us, who say, no, I think this is not the way to go. Because then instead of trying to argue with them violently or by insulting them or by attacking them, you just go and connect to what is driving their behavior, which is anxiety. It's anxiety. A lot of that is the shadow, essentially, which is being projected on a mass scale. So the shadow of alienation, of jobs that don't make any sense, that the rich are getting richer and the middle class is being wiped out. The shadow that automation will take over jobs. The shadow is why I'm 50 or 60 years old and then I'm no longer relevant. That is the kind of concern that people have. And really, neither party is talking about it. The middle boy, the middle class, the working class Joe, the pizza, the restaurant owner, the laundry, they're not really being represented by nobody. Because as far as everybody concerned, they're the little guys. We can do away with it. They'll just get a job at Amazon or somewhere else, and that's really not the way we're supposed to be as Americans. We're supposed to be for all. And we got wiped out the middle class. The middle class are the ones who support the arts. It's not the rich now anymore. It's not the middle class. When they're gone, all of a sudden, there is very little support for arts or for books or anything. You got the very poor with downtrodden, and then the super rich, and you got this kind of technocratic elite. Chris Hedges talks about that, and he's a very well-known liberal, left-wing kind of progressive writer. But he says that essentially what led to the Trump years was a kind of a disenfranchisement by the elites of the middle class. And then small guys were not represented. And one thing about I never went to a Trump meeting or a Trump rally, but one thing that I heard that there was a sense of unity, a real focus. You see what I mean? See, that now has been transferred to instead of focusing on him because he's pretty much out of the picture, focusing on the pandemic. It's that sense of connection. But we really shouldn't need a Trump or we shouldn't need a pandemic to bring us together. Whatever happened to what it meant to be American and have those values as a collective, not anymore as one position, one goal, one person. We either stand together or fall together. You can no longer a nation divided cannot will fall, and that's something that we really got to keep in mind because that's the key to really regaining our position with the world, our authority. Um, Luckily, I think there have been some changes in today's news that suggest something is going to be happening in the next few months. But we're still in the midst of the battle here, and the battle's for the control of the human mind. So the one takeaway I ask everyone is to really think for yourself. Number one, and no one has a monopoly on the information. No one. There's just too many pieces of data. Uh, some might feel the information supports one narrative versus another, but no one has it. Understand that these guys, these talking heads, whether it be Fauci or Walensky or they're just talking heads. Many of them are bureaucrats. They're not really the real scientists. You want to talk to real scientists, doctors and lawyers, and I mean scientists, doctors, epidemiologists, virologists, and so on, and see what they have to say. I mean, and sometimes you'll get some information that's not usually available to the public. But that's the key thing. To really understand that there is a battle for your attention, for your mind, for your soul, and you really, as long as you remain a sovereign individual and you can think for yourself and make the decisions you need, you will be able to navigate the rough waters, whether it be this pandemic or other things that might happen in the future. That the media may want to drum up some other drama that pulls us again back from ourselves, back from our daily lives into something we really have no control. We're just spectators. The key is you want to become the director and producer of your own life. So you want your life to be so exciting that you don't think that this is in the background. And that's the key thing. Find out the things in your life that may have meaning, that have relevance, and that really make you feel alive. In a previous talk, I mentioned this idea that their life, essentially, life leaves clues. You look at all the clues, all the things in your life that when those moments you really felt alive, maybe it's time to put them all together and find out what pattern emerges from all that. Maybe now is the time to step forward and create that kind of world that will give you a lot of meaning. So when you have that reality, when you're in that reality, you'll be a lot more, your immune system, both physically and psychologically, will be stronger and will be able to deal with all the challenges of what it means to be human rather than rely on technology as a clutch, as a kind of chaperone. And that's at the end of the day, we are human. We're not machines. We have more than just mechanistic systems. There's much more to that. And we really begin to understand who we are. And then that gives you the power to move forward and to deal with whatever comes up, deal with adversity. And that's when true freedom truly emerges. Freedom is something we have to earn or re-earn because I think we've given away too much of our freedom to others, thinking what others are thinking, what others are saying. You got to make those conclusions, draw them out based on yourself, no matter what the consequences are, and really move forward with that. And that's the key thing. The takeaway from this program is to really Philip K. Dick would have supported that because I do feel that although he had some challenges, I think he felt there was especially during the Nixon years. He felt there was a trampling of democracy. And I think something similar is happening right now before us, but not through the administration, but through the corporate elites that are trying to push a particular agenda. Some people call it a new world order. Some people, I call it just the third consciousness. Something is there. You don't have to necessarily follow a conspiracy theme. All you understand is the aggregation of all these information flows is leading to a kind of vast, active, living system created by these systems that kind of regulates everything, an auto-regulatory system. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And we don't need to look for any one specific person who was behind that, kind of a mastermind. That's the old style way of thinking. It's something a lot more complex. We're dealing with complex, chaotic systems right now. And that's the thing to remember. But at the end of the day, it's all about you and your ability to put together a world map that will inform your reality and will enrich your reality and will make you a powerful human being, um, and be able to shine like all of us are meant to be. And so, for those who have not picked up the book, it's called The Theater of the Mind, and I'm focusing on techniques and more specific ways of deprogramming ourselves from all this stuff. But I think I'll be putting out another book very shortly that focuses more on what's happening right now. So look, this has been a little bit of a serious, but I think it's important, it's warranted, because we really need to have this face-to-face conversation, really about the nature of reality and how do we move forward. I've always been very suspicious of any one group dominating the discussion. We really, at the end of the day, we are fair Americans, and we are fair. We should give the other side an opportunity to share, and that in ourselves as well. So if we have parts of us that are at odds with each other, start by acknowledging them. Start by saying, yes, there's a part of me that likes to do this, and a part of me wants security, a part of me wants freedom. How can I work the two together? So and this is the thing. So when I talk about the theater of the mind, the theater of the mind is not just an external, but it's an internal process. So whatever is happening outside is happening inside your mind. And but the great thing about it is you can step up and start shaping that to your liking, to your image, to your own image. And as a result, we sort of copy our creator. By doing so, we honoring our creator, and we become more like him in our ability to start shaping that internal world. So we don't no longer drawn by these trivial things or things that are important to others but not to ourselves, and really become sovereign human beings. And as Americans, we've always proven to be people like this. And I think it's time to step up and to really be the kind of self-reliant individual people. We rugged individuals. The legend. It's time to step up to the legend and really be that kind of person. I think we all have that. We just have to wake up and really make that happen. And I think that very soon we'll do that. It will be a slow process. And some people are waking up more than others. But I think we really need to make it happen, make it the central mission. And anyone who thinks that this is the end, that COVID and they'll be back to normal, is probably in for another surprise, because I don't think that the powers that be want normal anymore. The press certainly wants more drama so they can make money off the drama. The administration wants so they can stay in power. The corporation, they want it because so they can make more money, and so on. It goes on. They have a nice trick now. And I'm hoping they don't realize that we can fall for that same trick twice. So, and I think we're all being to learn and have a careful eye on the ball. So thank you for coming and tuning in. Again, I think I felt that it was very important for me to share it, because especially with some recent developments I've had with some of my clients, and I realized we really need to have a talk about this kind of a hypnosis that's been created on a world scale. It's not just the US. In fact, other countries is much worse. In Austria, if you starting in February 1st, they'll throw you in jail. Germany is not too far behind. Also, Australia has detention camps, even though the number of deaths is only in the hundreds. Detention camps. Washington State recently passed. They introduced the bill, but it was rejected. about the idea of reincorporating, bringing back detention centers. So there's still some power people out there who want change, but I think we have a strong sense of liberty and fairness, and I think the world's looking up to us, even though our image has been tarnished by a lot of things that have happened over the years. It's time for us to really be the example, the role model we have been called to be as Americans. So, again, thank you all for coming, and look, you have a good night and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye.